we will get all the incentive related to that, like viability gap funding, like special rate of interest, faster depreciation and all that. Unfortunately, it has not been operationalized, sir. And now they have put the ball in your court, sir. They say there is a Dr. Farik committee which is there with you, and that committee has to make it operationalized, sir. I don't know how that is linked. So they have put the ball in your court. Maybe we will need your support to make it operationalized, sir.
Thank you. Gentleman here. Yes, sir.
My name is JP Garg. Actually, I am very grateful for a very brief summarization of the telecom scenario in our country by Mr. Montek Singh. I just want to give one or two suggestions for the policy making. Internet, as we all know, is very low in India compared to most of the countries. And while earlier was a voice era, and now we have entering the broadband era. So for that purpose, unless proper planning and policies are laid down, the things will not happen, because our last few years' experience has shown that we have achieved very little in this direction. I feel and I believe that unless the government policies which are laid down are sustained and consistent, the investments will not come. Because any investor in especially in the telecom field, where the technology is marching ahead at a very fast rate, it is very essential that he should know the roadmap of the policies for the future, so that he can invest and get his money back in an appropriate time and at an appropriate rate. So sustain and consistency in the policies, which was there in the early era of the telecom revolution from 1992 when the liberalization took place, has been missing for the last several years. And I would request that attention needs to be paid. My second point is that the mobile internet will have to be cared for, because our rural areas and other population will get the benefits of internet much faster and rapid if we go for mobile internet. So mobile internet should supplement whatever is being tried to be achieved through landline. But in India, it is our belief that mobile internet will overtake the landline because of the various facts that even our rural population wants mobility also along with the broadband, because they have not taken the full advantage of the digital divide, etc., that they could use the mobile systems and mobile telephony. And in the roadmap, while the roadmap is being drawn, the spectrum availability roadmap is the most important factor which should be given out, so that the people can plan and invest and make the path easier for the internet broadband to expand. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garg. We have one last question, and we'll collect all of them and then we'll get you to respond.
Thank you, Rajat. Sir, that was an excellent roundup. I think you must have been a fly on the wall during the day, because you've sort of summed up all the points which were being made. But I think there's one extra element in this entire piece. We are moving, as Dr. Rajat Kathuria very correctly summed up, we're moving into the next phase of the telecom revolution, and it's moving from just a one-to-one telecom to a one-to-many and data-based thing, as Ajit is also very correctly talking about. Accompanying this is the challenge of how to manage the enormous amount of data which streams out of it. And therefore also, I think Ajit will also bear with me on this, is the question of how we handle this data and the question around security. Now, when I use the word security, I'm not thinking of it from the standpoint of national security, which is the large cloak which is used to color everything under the guise of security. This is just the fundamental handling of data and information. It's privacy. It's my information becoming suddenly available at the local PSI's office because he's made a query about all the calls which have been made on one particular cell site within a certain period of time. Now, information of this nature needs to be handled carefully. It needs to be handled with a great deal of concern, because it can get into third-party hands. And how do you handle it, really? Do you have a disaster recovery mechanism? We are currently, as operators, expected to retain data for a defined period of time. But the legal system runs on its own clock. So I got a query today referring to an event which took place 4 years ago, and I don't have the data with me, but I am not believed. So, we have these challenges where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, or is not even aware of what they are supposed to know. So I think data security and handling of data security could also be included in the ICRIER report, sir. Thank you.
Rajat, I just want to put in my 2 bits before the evening closes down. I won't get an audience like this again for some time. It is a matter of life and death that BSNL and MTNL are revived and made dynamic. It is a matter of life and death, because we have to dig roads in Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, Madras, the urban cities, and put fiber underground. There is no fiber underground. Do not believe the telecom operators. I know. To do that, there must be some entity which can exercise eminent domain, and they are the only guys who can do it. So it's very, very important. Please do not join the general plot to discredit those two guys. I think they've gone through a bad time. Secondly, and this is more heretic, for those of us who come from the computer science background, we get amused by this discussion on spectrum sharing and spectrum squatting and auctions and so on. This might employ a lot of people in Delhi, but it makes us laugh. I'll tell you the reason. If you give it to a computer science person, he will say, I will dynamically allocate the spectrum. Okay? I will dynamically, there are algorithms which can dynamically allocate it using game theory. So the only catch is the value of the spectrum then becomes 0. There is no squatting rights. At the moment, there is value because we run it like Cornwallis permanent settlement. Remember your history? It's run like that. There is amount of land. He said, I can't collect the tax from these Indian peasants, so you take it. I call you a zamindar and you give me money. So that era you must forget. Now, my only distress about, I think ICRIER should study, this dynamic allocation. The only catch is you will find no supporters for it, because the entrepreneur now thinks getting the spectrum is the only value, and we have apparently demonstrated his market cap will be 0. His market cap then will be dependent on the actual revenue and usage of that spectrum, which requires deep technical knowledge. Now, Indian Telecom operators don't have it. You know why they don't have it? They thought they were very smart, and 10 years ago outsourced their entire network operation to IBM and Ericsson and others. So that entire expertise was lost 10 years ago. That's the reason. So please think of all this, then don't look at it just as economists. Now, Rajat, so my last 2 bits.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you mentioned dynamic allocation of spectrum, because I understand this is a new thing. And I thought, what's his name, Rohan Murthy was supposed to come but I don't know if you had a session on that.
Yeah, we have some professors at IMCAL who are experts in this. Okay.
No, I 100% agree. It's one of those things I'm kind of aware of without understanding. I do think that, you should put it on the agenda. Some of the other issues, of course, the OFC, if you could have done it by PPP, I have no problem. It's a right-of-way problem that most people thought that would be very difficult to get right-of-way if you went the PPP route. In the sense that having a PPP arrangement and then not getting right-of-way would just lead to endless disputes. Whether that's correct or not, I don't know. But I think you mentioned that the right-of-way issue kind of tends to lend itself to continuing through public entities. And, I think if public entities are managed, they're usually quite good at achieving defined objectives. Where they're not very good is dealing with customer service and giving different service packages. So I think part of the problem of the shifting targets is just that, it hasn't really been perceived as something that should be given the importance it does. I think that's now changing. So while it's true that the targets keep getting shifted, I think now it's quite high on people's awareness. So hopefully that'll certainly work. You know, on I think an issue of incentives. I'm not aware, by the way, you know, it sort of seems to be assumed here that if you're going to be declared an infrastructure industry, then some kind of a huge harvest of benefits is supposed to come. I mean, there are certain benefits that are meant for infrastructure industries, and those I think do go. But I don't think that many of the people seem to think that if you're called an infrastructure industry, then it's an open day for demanding incentives. That's not the case. So I think you better look and see what are the incentives that are meant to be given, and I think they should certainly be available. Now, you know, there are problem areas like, for example, telecom is infrastructure, but the separate business of putting towers, is that part of infrastructure or isn't? So there are some clarificatory type of things that have to come up. But I think that's something which, out of this conference, you should actually certainly put on the agenda. I think the data privacy issue is actually quite important. Again, it's new, and it's going to come in big time in our international interactions, whether it's the Europeans or the Americans and so on. So I do think that, I don't think you addressed it in the conference, at least I didn't see it. I wasn't, by the way, a fly on the wall. I just saw the list of subjects that I knew were being discussed. I agree that I think, you know, anything that involves interaction with other countries, and then countries make certain demands, I think we should, rather than simply resenting demands, we should lay out quite clearly what is our objective. Then we can actually negotiate. But it is a very important area, and I think I would urge you to include that in your gift to the Planning Commission as an input into the midterm appraisal. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ajit. Thank you, Montek. I think this was another very good session, very stimulating, provocative in part, but I think a very good session. And indeed, much like Rajat Mukherjee sitting there, I also felt that Montek must have been listening in. I won't use the phrase that you used. Montek must have been listening into the deliberation since the morning, because, you know, he summarized very well, in fact, what we had discussed. And although our agenda has, and I wouldn't dare to refuse the Planning Commission, what they're asking for, so we'll expand our agenda. And two items specifically which we hadn't thought of, which have come out from this final session, is what is the fate of MTNL and BSNL going to be, and I think that's an important point. And I think a knee-jerk reaction of a number of people is privatize and we will solve our problem. But we have to examine it from the local context, and, you know, we will not only take on board what has been suggested here, but I think we will look at international evidence and, you know, what happened to BT. I'm aware of the BT experience, what they did, but we'll take on board, you know, stakeholder views, and also look at what's happened internationally to then look at what can be reasonably done with MTNL and BSNL. They have huge amounts of equity not in the traditional financial sense, but they have a huge amount of equity, they have a huge amount of goodwill, so we need to see how that can be leveraged. The second thing that we hadn't thought about is the whole issue relating to data privacy and internet governance in general. So I think that is again an extremely important issue, and we need to expand that to make this a holistic report. The other issues that have been discussed since the morning, and we've got a lot of good input, you know, broadband infrastructure, necessary and sufficient conditions, applications that run on them, how do you kind of energize those applications, how can they best work, what are the requirements, what is the environment. We'll do all of that. That is something that we had thought of doing, and we'll do that. But certain new ideas that have come up while I was just jotting down while Montek and Ajit were speaking is, are we doing our OFC in the right way, or is there a different way? Are there policy choices available with the government? This is something that we'd look at. And spectrum trading, and Montek, to respond to one of the points that you made, and this was discussed in the morning, spectrum trading and spectrum sharing, I think they're acknowledged by the speakers as good things in general, but I think they also mentioned that it cannot be a substitute for insufficiency of spectrum. While they are good in the fact that they're being introduced, but can they be a substitute for lack of adequate spectrum? And there was a whole discussion around how the quantity of spectrum can be actually increased, and you mentioned yourself that MOD would give some of its spectrum that can be then used